The ocean stretched out endlessly in front of me, its waves glittering under the late morning sunlight. A salty breeze swept past, brushing against my skin as I stood behind the small windbreaker we had set up earlier. I was struggling to peel off the damp bikini that clung to me like a second skin. It was supposed to be a quick, quiet moment, a chance to dry off and slip into something more comfortable before heading back to the house. But the sticky swimsuit refused to cooperate, twisting awkwardly and making the task feel like an uphill battle. Frustrated, I finally grabbed the loose sundress draped over the back of a chair and tugged it over my head, letting out a small sigh of relief. The familiar softness of the fabric was a comforting change from the clammy swimsuit. As I smoothed the dress over my hips and adjusted the straps, a voice broke through the sound of the waves. "Rachel," he said. I froze, my heart jolting in my chest. Slowly, I turned to see Ethan standing just beyond the edge of the windbreaker. His dark hair was tousled by the breeze, and the sunlight highlighted the warmth of his sun-kissed skin. "Ethan," I stammered, my hands instinctively moving to my chest. His eyes widened slightly, and it hit me with a sinking realization. I hadn't fully adjusted the neckline of my dress. Heat flushed my cheeks as I hastily pulled the fabric into place, fumbling to cover myself. "I'm sorry," he blurted out, his voice faltering as he quickly turned his back to me. "No, it's fine," I said, though my voice shook with embarrassment. "I wasn't expecting anyone." "I didn't mean to startle you," he said, his tone apologetic but edged with something unspoken. For a moment, we both stood there in an awkward silence, the crashing waves the only sound between us. My mind raced, trying to push away the embarrassment and think of something to say. "It's okay," I managed with a forced laugh. "You just caught me at a bad time." Ethan turned back cautiously, his expression hesitant. "I should have called out or something. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said quickly, waving him off. But as I met his gaze, I caught a flicker of something in his eyes, something that made my stomach tighten uncomfortably. Ethan had always been attentive. Ever since I married his father, David, years ago, he'd stepped into the role of a dutiful stepson without hesitation. And when David passed away, Ethan took it upon himself to look after me, always checking in, fixing things around the house, and encouraging me to join family gatherings even when I preferred to keep to myself. He was dependable and thoughtful, a lot like his dad. But lately, there'd been something different. It was subtle, like a quiet shift in the air. It was in the way his gaze lingered on me longer than usual, or how his hand brushed against mine when he handed me something. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt undeniable, especially now, in this moment. "I just came to see if you wanted lunch," Ethan said, snapping me out of my thoughts. "Oh," I said, grateful for the distraction. "That sounds nice." He nodded, his usual easygoing smile creeping back, though there was still a tension in the air. "There's a cafe down the road. I can grab us something to bring back if you'd like." "That'd be great," I replied, forcing a smile. "Okay," he said, hesitating briefly before turning to leave. "I'll be back soon." As I watched him walk away, his shoulders relaxed slightly, but the tension lingered, hovering like a cloud. I sank into the beach chair, my heart racing as I stared out at the endless waves. What had just happened? It was such a small, insignificant moment, just a misunderstanding, but I couldn't shake the look in Ethan's eyes or the fluttering unease it stirred in me. When he returned about an hour later, he was carrying a bag with 2 neatly wrapped sandwiches and a couple of iced teas. I was sitting on the deck of the small beach house, a weathered paperback novel lying forgotten in my lap. "You look comfortable," he said, setting the bag down on the small table between us. I replied with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. My mind had been spinning since our earlier encounter, replaying it over and over in frustrating clarity. "Well," he said, handing me a sandwich, "I figured we could eat out here. Can't beat the view." I nodded, grateful for the simplicity of the moment. The ocean stretched out before us, the sound of the waves steady and soothing as we ate in a companionable silence. After a while, Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the water. This place hasn't changed much, he said softly. No, it hasn't, I murmured, following his gaze. He turned to look at me, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Do you remember the time Dad tried to build a bonfire out here? Even though it was way too windy? I laughed, the memory surfacing with surprising vividness. How could I forget? He spent half the night chasing flying embers and the other half burning the marshmallows. Completely black, Ethan added, shaking his head with a grin. I smiled back, though the ache in my chest was hard to ignore. The memory brought David back so clearly, even after 4 years without him. You miss him, don't you? Ethan asked gently, his voice soft. I nodded, swallowing the lump that had risen in my throat. Every day. Every single day, I replied softly. Ethan reached over, his hands settling gently over mine. The gesture was familiar, comforting in a way that caught me off guard. But this time, there was something different, a tenderness in his touch that made my breath hitch. I think he'd be happy to see us here, Ethan said, his voice steady and sincere. I met his gaze, my chest tightening at the earnestness in his expression. You really think so? I know so, he said with quiet certainty, his hand lingering on mine for a moment longer than necessary before he pulled it away. The afternoon slipped by as we fell into the kind of easy conversation that had always come naturally between us. Ethan talked about his job, a new project he was considering, and a funny story about a coworker who managed to lock himself out of his car 3 times in a single week. I laughed harder than I had in months, the sound feeling foreign but oddly freeing. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt lighter, like some of the weight I'd been carrying had lifted, if only temporarily. But there was something else too. Something unspoken. It lingered in the way Ethan's gaze held mine just a second too long, or how his voice softened when he said my name. I told myself I was imagining things, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. As the sun began to sink lower on the horizon, Ethan suggested taking a walk along the beach. I hesitated, unsure if being alone with him was the best idea, but the thought of moving around and clearing my head was too tempting to pass up. We walked side by side, the cool sand shifting beneath our feet as the waves rolled in, brushing the shoreline. At first, the conversation was light, memories of family vacations and stories from his childhood. But as the sky turned shades of pink and orange, the tone changed. You've been quiet lately, Ethan said, glancing over at me. Have I? I asked, though I knew he was right. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. You've been through a lot, he said gently. I just want to make sure you're okay. My chest tightened, and I hesitated before answering. I'm figuring things out, I said finally. That's okay, he replied, his tone calm and reassuring. You don't have to have all the answers right now. There was something about the kindness in his voice that made my throat tighten. I turned away, focusing on the horizon as we continued down the beach. When the wind picked up, sending a chill through me, Ethan wordlessly slipped off his jacket and draped it over my shoulders. Thanks, I murmured, pulling it tighter around me. He smiled, his hand brushing against mine as we walked. The contact was fleeting, but it sent a warmth through me that I couldn't ignore. My pulse quickened despite myself. Back at the house, the air between us felt thick, charged with an unspoken tension. Ethan paused in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame as he turned to look at me. Good night, Rachel, he said, his voice low and steady. Good night, I replied, my heart pounding as I watched him retreat to his room. When the door clicked shut, I exhaled shakily, my thoughts racing. The connection between us was undeniable, but the implications of what it meant, or could mean, were overwhelming. As I lay in bed that night, the soothing sound of the waves outside lulling me to sleep, I couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted between us. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was ready for what that meant. The next morning, golden sunlight filtered through the windows, promising another warm, peaceful day. I found Ethan in the kitchen, already brewing coffee, the rich aroma filling the air. Morning, he said, flashing me a smile that seemed to cut through the unease lingering from the night before. Good morning, I replied, sliding into one of the chairs at the small wooden table. Ethan poured a cup of coffee and set it in front of me before leaning casually against the counter. There was something about his presence that was both comforting and disarming. I was thinking, he began, his tone light, maybe we could take the kayaks out today. It's been a while since I've seen you on the water. I hesitated, torn between excitement and nerves. I don't know if I even remember how, I admitted. His smile turned playful. I'll teach you, he said confidently. It'll be fun, I promise. Before I could second-guess myself, the decision was made. The bay was calm, the sunlight dancing across the water as we dragged the kayaks to the shore. Ethan steadied mine while I climbed in, his hands firm but gentle. You've got this, he reassured me, giving the kayak a gentle push into the shallows. At first, I fumbled with the paddle, struggling to find a rhythm. Ethan stayed close, his own kayak gliding effortlessly beside mine as he offered quiet guidance. Relax your shoulders, he said calmly. Let the paddle do most of the work. I followed his advice, and before long, I was moving smoothly across the water. See, he said, his smile widening. Told you it would come back to you. I laughed, the sound echoing over the bay. Okay, you were right, I admitted, grinning. We paddled farther out, leaving the houses behind as the water deepened into a rich, endless blue. Ethan led us to a small cove, tucked away behind rocky cliffs, the kind of place only locals would know about. This is incredible, I said, my voice hushed in awe. I thought you'd like it, he replied, his kayak drifting closer to mine. We floated there for a while, the gentle lapping of the water creating a peaceful rhythm. The tension from the day before seemed to melt away, replaced by an easy familiarity that felt both comforting and bittersweet. But on the way back, something shifted. Ethan's kayak drifted close, and as he reached out to steady mine against a sudden current, his hand brushed against mine. The touch was fleeting but sent an undeniable spark through me. Our eyes met, and for a moment, everything around us seemed to fall away. Rachel, he said softly, his voice steady but filled with meaning. I looked away quickly, unable to hold his gaze. We should get back, I murmured, my voice trembling. Right, he replied after a pause, though there was a tension in his tone that was impossible to ignore. Back at the house, the air felt heavy again, thick with everything left unsaid. I busied myself in the kitchen, putting together lunch, while Ethan lingered in the living room, flipping through a magazine with an absent air. Do you need help? Ethan's voice carried into the kitchen, cutting through the quiet. No, I've got it, I replied quickly, though my hands trembled slightly as I chopped the vegetables. A few minutes later, he appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. You sure? He asked again, his tone light, but his eyes held a seriousness that was hard to ignore. I nodded, keeping my focus on the cutting board. But when Ethan stepped closer and grabbed a knife to slice the bread, my heart started racing at the proximity. As we worked side by side, the tension in the air grew almost unbearable. Every accidental brush of our hands, every fleeting glance, seemed to carry a weight neither of us wanted to acknowledge. At one point, as I reached for a plate, Ethan's hand covered mine. I froze, my breath catching as I looked up at him. Rachel, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The air between us felt electric, and before I knew it, I was leaning ever so slightly toward him. Realizing what I was doing, I snapped back, shaking my head. I should finish this, I said quickly, my voice trembling. Right, he said, his hand dropping back to his side. That evening, after dinner, Ethan suggested a bonfire on the beach. I'll set it up, he said, already gathering the supplies before I could answer. I followed him down to the shore, the cool evening breeze brushing against my skin as the sun disappeared below the horizon. Ethan worked with practiced ease, stacking the wood and coaxing the flames to life. We sat together on the sand, the fire crackling softly between us. For a while, the conversation was light, easy. But as the fire burned lower, the mood shifted again. "I'm glad we did this," Ethan said, his voice quiet but certain. "Me too," I replied, though my chest tightened at the weight of his words. He turned toward me, his expression serious. "I meant what I said earlier," he began. "You've been quiet lately, and I just want to make sure you're okay." "I'm fine," I said quickly, but the words sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Rachel," he said, his voice low but insistent. "You don't have to pretend with me." His words broke something loose inside me, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted, my voice trembling. "You don't have to figure it out alone," he said, his hand covering mine. The closeness felt overwhelming. As the fire crackled softly, I found myself leaning toward him. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice shaky. He reached up and brushed a strand of hair from my face. "I'm here," he said softly, his gaze steady and sincere. For the first time in a long time, I let myself believe him. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. The sound of the waves outside seemed louder, almost like a steady heartbeat, a reminder of the tension still lingering between us. I busied myself in the kitchen, wiping down the counters even though they were already spotless. I told myself I was overthinking it all, that the moments between Ethan and me were just that, fleeting, inconsequential. But deep down, I knew better. When Ethan finally emerged from his room, his hair damp from a shower, he carried that same easy confidence he always did. But there was something softer in his eyes as he smiled at me. "Good morning," he said warmly. "Morning," I replied, my heart racing even at the simple exchange. "I was thinking," he began, leaning against the counter, "we could head into town today. Grab some lunch, maybe check out the market." It was a casual suggestion, but the way his gaze lingered made it feel like something more. By late afternoon, we were wandering through the seaside market, the salty breeze mingling with the scent of fresh flowers and grilled seafood. Ethan stayed close, his presence grounding me as we explored the stalls. At one booth, I reached for a necklace, a simple pendant shaped like a seashell. "It suits you," Ethan said, his voice quiet but sure. I glanced at him, feeling warmth rise to my cheeks under his gaze. "You think so?" "Definitely," he replied, his eyes soft. I hesitated, unsure whether to buy it, but before I could decide, Ethan handed cash to the vendor and slipped the necklace into my hand. "Ethan," I began, but he shook his head with a small smile. "Just take it," he said. "Consider it a thank you for coming here with me." I slid the necklace into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cool metal as we continued through the market. By the time we returned to the house, the sun was setting, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. I was tired, but there was a quiet warmth in my chest that hadn't been there earlier. After dinner, Ethan suggested another walk on the beach. "I promise I won't keep you out too late," he teased, his grin boyish. I laughed softly, nodding. "Okay, just a quick one." The beach was nearly deserted, the last traces of daylight fading into the horizon. The cool sand shifted beneath my feet, and the rhythmic crash of the waves felt soothing. Ethan walked beside me, his hands tucked into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the water. "I'm glad we did this," he said after a while, his voice quiet. "Me too," I replied, though my chest tightened. He stopped walking and turned to face me. "Rachel," he began, his tone careful. "I need to say something." I froze, my heart pounding. He hesitated, pulling his hands from his pockets. "I don't know when it started," he said, his voice low, "but I can't stop thinking about you." I whispered his name, barely audible. "I know this is complicated," he continued, his gaze steady. "But I can't ignore how I feel. And I don't think you can either." The air between us felt impossibly thick, every word he said settling heavily on my chest. It's not something we can just," I trailed off, my voice trembling. "Why not?" he interrupted, stepping closer. "Why can't we? We're both adults. We know what this is. But what if it's wrong? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. And what if it's right? He countered, his eyes searching mine. The simplicity of his question left me speechless. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I struggled to answer. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine. I'm not asking you to decide anything right now, Ethan said softly. His voice carried a calm steadiness, but I could see the vulnerability in his eyes. I just need you to know how I feel. For a moment, all I could do was stare at him, my chest tightening with a mix of fear and longing. Then, before I could talk myself out of it, I stepped closer, my hand tentatively reaching for his. Ethan, I whispered, my voice breaking under the weight of the moment. He cupped my face gently, his hands warm and steady against my skin. Just tell me one thing, he said, his voice firm but soft. Do you feel it too? Yes, I admitted, the word tumbling out before I could stop it. Relief washed over his face, softening his expression. He leaned down, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was hesitant at first but quickly deepened into something more. It was charged, intense, like everything we'd been holding back had finally burst free. The world seemed to fade around us. The rhythmic crash of the waves and the cool night air disappeared into the background as his hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer. I wrapped my arms around his neck, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. Every nerve, every emotion, every part of me felt awake, raw, and undeniable. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless, our foreheads resting together as the weight of what had just happened settled over us. This changes everything, I whispered, my voice trembling with the enormity of it all. It doesn't have to, Ethan replied, his tone steady and comforting. We can take this one step at a time. I nodded, though fear still lingered at the edges of my mind. Okay, I said finally, though my voice was barely above a whisper. We walked back to the house in silence. The tension that had hung between us was now replaced by something quieter, a fragile understanding. At the door, Ethan turned to me, his expression soft. Good night, Rachel, he said, his voice low. Good night, I replied, my heart still pounding as I watched him step inside. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me, the way his touch had made me feel. We'd crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed, but for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. The next morning, the house felt different. The air was heavier, the silence louder, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of what had happened. I lingered in the kitchen, staring blankly into my coffee mug as if it held the answers I desperately needed. My mind replayed the night before on a relentless loop, the way his lips had felt against mine, the way his hands had steadied me, grounding me in a moment that felt both terrifyingly wrong and impossibly right. The sound of Ethan's footsteps on the stairs pulled me from my thoughts. When I turned, he was standing in the doorway, his hair tousled and his expression cautious. Good morning, he said, his voice soft. Morning, I replied, though my voice barely carried. He stepped into the room, moving slowly as if afraid to disturb the delicate balance between us. I was thinking, he began, his tone casual but measured, we could spend the day in. Just relax. I nodded, grateful for the simplicity of the suggestion. That sounds nice. We spent the morning in the living room, the television on but ignored. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the space between us feeling both vast and suffocatingly small. At one point, Ethan reached for the remote, his hand brushing against mine. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, and I pulled my hand back quickly, my cheeks warming. Sorry, he murmured, his voice low and tinged with regret. It's fine, I replied automatically, though the words felt like a lie. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, stretching between us like a chasm. The tension was palpable, unspoken words crackling in the air like static. By the time afternoon arrived, the weight of it all had become unbearable. I couldn't stay in that room, suffocating under the pressure of everything left unsaid. I needed space, a chance to breathe, to think, to untangle the mess inside my head. I retreated to the deck, the cool ocean breeze brushing against my skin as I stared out at the endless stretch of water. The gentle rhythm of the waves should have been soothing, but it only seemed to amplify the storm raging within me. I didn't hear Ethan approach, his footsteps silent against the wooden planks. I only realized he was there when I felt his presence beside me, steady and unyielding like the tide itself. "Rachel," he murmured, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. I turned toward him, my heart tightening at the look on his face. His expression was serious, his eyes dark with an intensity that made my breath catch. "We can't keep dancing around this," he said, his voice quiet but firm. I swallowed hard, his words hitting me like a wave. "I know," I whispered, my voice fragile, barely audible. Ethan took a step closer, his gaze never wavering. "Talk to me," he said softly, though there was an unspoken command behind his words, one that made my pulse quicken. His tone wasn't demanding, it was something else, an invitation. He was giving me space, offering me the chance to speak, to let him in, to trust him with the storm I'd been trying so desperately to hide. But the question was, could I? Please. The word hung in the air between us, and I froze. The emotions I'd been holding back for so long suddenly felt too heavy, too tangled, to put into words. My chest tightened as hesitation settled deep within me, rooting me in place. I wanted to speak, but nothing came. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I managed to whisper, "I don't know how to do this." Ethan's response was immediate, yet so gentle it felt like a balm to my frayed nerves. "You don't have to," he said, his voice steady and soothing. "We'll figure it out together." His words were more than a reassurance, they were a lifeline, a quiet promise wrapped in sincerity. They caught me off guard, the depth of his conviction chipping away at the doubt I'd carried for so long. But still, I hesitated, pulling my hand back slightly, unsure if I could let myself believe him. "But what if," I started, my voice trembling, only to be interrupted by the warmth of his hand reaching for mine. His touch steadied me, anchoring me in the storm of my thoughts. "What if it works?" he said, his voice insistent but tender, carrying a quiet urgency that left no room for escape. My heart pounded, my pulse quickening as I tried to meet his gaze, but the weight of his words made it almost impossible. "Ethan," I began, my voice wavering, "this is so much more complicated than you realize." He took a slow, deliberate breath, his eyes never leaving mine. "I know exactly how complicated it is," he said softly, yet with a certainty that reverberated in the space between us. "And I don't care. I care about you." The words hung there, suspended in the air between us, and I realized in that moment they weren't just words. They were a declaration, a choice. He wasn't asking me to erase the messiness or simplify the chaos. He was telling me, with raw honesty, that he was choosing me despite it all. The sheer weight of his sincerity shattered something deep inside me, breaking through a barrier I hadn't even known was there. A knot I'd carried for what felt like forever began to loosen, and before I could second-guess myself, I stepped closer to him. My hand reached out, trembling slightly, as if searching for the warmth of his touch. "I care about you too," I confessed, my voice barely a whisper, as though the truth was too fragile to say aloud. But it was real, undeniably real, and I knew he could feel it in the way the words landed between us. Ethan gently lifted my hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to the back of my knuckles. The gesture was simple, but it carried a weight that went far beyond words. "This doesn't have to be perfect," he said, his voice steady but filled with quiet strength. "It just has to be real." The words settled over me like a warm blanket, grounding me in the moment. He was right, this didn't have to be flawless or easy. What mattered was that it was honest. Later that evening, as the sky deepened into twilight, Ethan casually suggested watching a movie. We settled on the couch, an invisible line still drawn between us, one neither of us was sure we were ready to cross. But as the minutes passed, the space between us seemed to shrink, little by little, until I felt the weight of his arm resting over my shoulders. It wasn't rushed or hesitant, it felt natural, as if it had always belonged there. I leaned into him, letting his warmth envelop me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to let go. My head rested gently against his chest, and in that quiet moment, I exhaled, truly exhaled, as though I was finally releasing the fear and uncertainty that had been holding me captive. The movie played on, though I barely noticed. Ethan's fingers brushed lightly against my arm, the subtle touch sending a ripple of electricity through me. A shiver raced down my spine, and I felt my breath catch as the sensation lingered, impossible to ignore. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice soft but laced with urgency. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned to look at him, my breath hitching as our eyes met. His gaze was intense, unwavering, and for a moment, the world seemed to blur around us. Time slowed, leaving only him and the weight of everything unspoken. "I can't stop thinking about you," he confessed, his voice barely more than a breath. The words felt like a secret, shared in the quiet intimacy of the room. Before I could find the words to respond, before I could even make sense of the emotions swirling inside me, he leaned in. His lips met mine in a kiss that was both gentle and desperate, a perfect blend of tenderness and longing. Everything we hadn't said, everything we'd been holding back, poured into that kiss. It was raw, unguarded, and undeniable. This time, I didn't pull away. I surrendered to the moment, to him, letting myself feel everything I'd tried so hard to suppress. The barriers we'd carefully built between us crumbled, each one falling away until nothing remained but the heat of his touch and the rhythmic thud of his heartbeat against mine. His hands, once tentative, now moved with a quiet confidence, pulling me closer as though he feared letting go. Every kiss, every touch felt like a promise, a vow of something more, something real, something that could no longer be ignored. The air around us seemed charged, electric, as if the universe itself had been waiting for this moment to unfold. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless, our bodies trembling from the intensity of what had just happened. The weight of the truth lingered between us, unspoken but understood. I knew, in that moment, that nothing would ever be the same. The fear of what lay ahead still lingered, but for the first time, it didn't feel insurmountable. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, that could be enough.